Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Kitchen Table, our family podcast at Lake Avenue Church here in Pasadena, where we have small talk but big conversations. We have our guest, Tsega Worku, who was here with me in my previous episode, so he doesn't need any more introductions, but I'm going to promote him today as my co-host because he will be asking most of the questions, because the guest we have today is a very close friend of him, Kevin Williams, who has been with Lake Avenue family for almost 40 years. Fascinating story you are about to hear, and he has been instrumental in many decision-making process here at Lake Avenue Church in this long period of time, right from being a member of ministry council to other, being an elder, deacon, whatever you name it, he has been there. I have had the privilege to meet Kevin's daughter, Kelly. This is the first time I'm formally meeting Kevin, but Kelly, if he is anything like Kelly, he would be my best friend. Like daughter, like father. I'm going to turn it around. An incredible woman with an amazing ministry of spoken words in theater, and somebody I would love to hang out with more and more. And I would hope that I can bring her to this podcast too one day. Anyway, but this is not about Kelly. This is about Kevin. So Kevin, let's start with that amazing story you just told me about your introduction to Lake Avenue Church and your first visit to Lake Avenue Church. Let's share with the audience that experience.
Yes, thank you, Mathew and Tsega, for inviting me. When I go back and look at how I originally came to Lake Avenue, I was going through a little minor tough time in my life, and my brother and sister-in-law had just gotten married, and they found a church home, and it was Lake Avenue. And since I didn't have a regular church home at that time, even though I've been a lifelong Christian, I said, well, let me come over there, because I'd always seen the church, but I had never been in there. Interesting, I get here, and all of a sudden, I'm like, there is nobody that looks like me or my brother or sister-in-law. And I think I counted that day. We were over in the Maple Street Chapel, and there were probably 4 or 5 people of color. And I said, okay, this is interesting. But what 2 things that struck me very hard was, the first thing was Pastor Cedar. He got up, and I understood it was like one of his first Sundays at the church, and he says, by the word of God, and he's a tall man, he stood up with his Bible, and he says, we are in Northwest Pasadena, and we've got to realize that this is our community, and we're going to minister not only to Northwest Pasadena, but to Pasadena at large. The other thing that struck me was that during the sermon, they had these little pads, and you could take notes on the sermon, had different questions. And it was the first time I had gone back to home, and I said, I took these notes, and I remembered what was actually said in the sermon. That struck me very well. The other thing that got me, and got me to come back the next Sunday, was an usher. And I God forbid, I can't remember his name, but it was an elderly gentleman, white hair, just a jovial guy. And he says, thank you so much for coming. I said, well, thank you. He says, I hope to see you next week. And I said, yeah, you will. And I came back, and he walked up, he greeted me with a nice warm handshake, and he says, thank you, Kevin, for coming back. I said, wow, he remembered my name. Mm-hmm. All these people, and at that time, they had like 3 or 4 services back to back to back. And I said, I was surprised he remembered my name. And the warmth of him as an individual, a greeter, usher, was what kept me coming back. Because there was a couple of times I didn't come for a couple of weeks. I haven't seen you in a couple of weeks. I'm like, wow, But the message, and then the warmth, having him come here. And then the second part of that, after I got married a few years later and moved to Los Angeles. And so Lake Avenue was not my church home. But what got us back was my father had started coming to Lake Avenue, and he says, hey, I want Kelly, our daughter, to be in the church choir for the kids, children's choir. So she was about 4 years old. So we said, we'll bring her to see her perform. And, they were, with Judy Cattenhorn, they were bringing kids in, and Kelly would sing, and then we found ourselves coming there. And then they said, well, if she's going to be, she might as well be in Sunday school. We ended up becoming Sunday school host or whatever, and ended up coming back to Lake full time. That was about 25, 26 years ago. And then just progress through various ministries, on up to the ministry council, and now currently just on the marriage mentoring program, my wife and I. So
it's very interesting you said that the pastor declared the location of the church, the Northwest Pasadena. Very often what gets mixed in the equation, when doing church ministry like I do, because there is always, we say, a big C church, which is the universal church, and the small C church, which is the local church. Very often we get confused about the church. Obviously, it's the body of Christ. It has a global or a universal nature to it, but it also has that localized. It has to respond to the culture. It has to respond to the neighborhood needs and the neighborhood dynamics, right? Correct. And so I would like to hear a little more about your experience being in the leadership and as a church. How do we connect with what is special about Pasadena in particular, right? Like, I'm trying to learn. I'm new to Pasadena. I'm a pastor here. So I would really like to know what is so unique about Pasadena. And as we talk right now, there is a big racial tension that exists in the society, in America in general, and in particular here. So can you address to that at what is so relevant or unique about the context of Pasadena to understand and minister to that specific context for Lake Avenue Church or any church in? Can you give any insights?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think I'd like to do just a little history on that. Sure. We came to Pasadena in 1965, moving from Los Angeles, and it was right before the Watts riots. And my dad said, "Hey, we want to move out here so that I can give you guys a better chance, a better life, an educational experience." And so we came out here, and it was interesting because when I went to Edison Elementary School, then Elliott Junior High School, at that time, when I first got to Elliott in the 7th grade, I believe that was 1967, there were 66, 67, there was only 6% African-American students there. In the 3 years I left, it ended up being about 16%. So there was a real migration, most of the people coming from Los Angeles to here. And I use that as a backdrop in terms of how the community was starting to change. One thing about where we bought our house on the central Altadena, West Altadena border. Reason being is because in 1965, there was actually redlining going on in the city of Pasadena. They would not show us any houses east of Lake Avenue because we were African American. They said, my dad said, "There's some nice houses over there." And the realtor was pretty honest. He said, "Well, we'd really rather show you some homes over here, and buyers aren't going to sell you their homes over there." So that was a unique. I'm like, as a 9-year-old kid, I'm thinking, what the heck is going on here, So we ended up buying our house there. Then we went on to Muir High School. Now, and that was in 1967, 68. Muir High School was a unique experiment. It was if you were a Muirite, you were a Muirite first. It didn't matter whether you were white, black, Hispanic, Asian. We had a large Japanese community. But you were all Muirites. And what was unique about Pasadena is that we were one of the only integrated schools. Muir was only the only integrated schools in the San Gabriel Valley, because to the west of us was La Cañada, Flint Ridge. You had Burbank, Glendale. Then to the east, you had Arcadia, San Marino. And just as a backdrop to go to some of these, we played football. And I remember being called some very choice things. When we played football, coming out of the tunnel, we were sped on by people saying, you shouldn't be here. We thought it was raining. It was actually people spitting on us. It was the parents, not the students, the parents. Wow. Different things that were said about us. And, because we were one of the only integrated teams. So that Muir was a very good experience in terms of people getting along. It was also... my name was Williams, last name, and by time I was in the 10th grade when I got there, where there were 6 classes, I had books for 2 of the 6 classes because they ran out of books. Now, that was at Muir High School. On the other side of the city, Pasadena High, they had an overabundance of brand new books. Well, it wasn't until the second week attending Muir that I got all my books. Some of them had missing pages. They were old. So we had to learn from there. But in spite of all that, I think those type of things brought us together because we recognized that was unfair. We had kids that were in Linda Vista who were very wealthy. We had kids who were in the Northwest Pasadena who were semi-poor. We had kids from Altadena who were suburban, upper middle class African Americans. We had, like I said, Japanese. We had Hispanics, Jewish kids. We all got together, and that actually brought us closer together. But there was again the background in it was at the time they were being sued, the Pasadena Board of Education, by three families. To the Spanglers and the Clarks, and good friends of ours. And it was just about having a better experience for our kids. And what they wanted was to keep that Muir experience, because what they started doing was siphoning off a lot of the white kids and sending them to other schools, and they wanted to make Muir the black school. And the parents were like, no. We like the makeup how it is. And that makeup was really good. There were bumper stickers on the car saying, "You're from Pasadena, Mississippi." Because it was worse segregation in Pasadena than it was in Mississippi. I was actually fortunate enough to be on a student committee for accreditation because of what the Pasadena Board of Education was doing. We were in fear of losing our accreditation at Muir High School. We were down to 5 classes instead of 6 or 7 for the semester. Now, let me tell you what a travesty that would have been. We had 4 kids at our school that had perfect scores on the SAT when people weren't getting perfect scores on the SAT. So we were in danger of losing our accreditation at that time. So.
Are you talking about mid-60s?
We're talking about, that was 1971, 72.
Okay.
Yeah. So they passed busing, and the integration was changing there with Pasadena there. So that's what was going on in the
Just out of curiosity, when all this is happening, what was the church doing in the middle of this? And not specifically Lake Avenue Church. How did church play a part, good or bad, or depending on the perspective? What was church in the middle of this? Just curious.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. There was a family by the name of the Dillingers, and at that time we were going to Altadena United Methodist Church, and the Dillingers were at our church. And they were the Dillinger family is just a lovely family. They saw people as people. Their son, Mark Dillinger, his girlfriend, and not that this makes a big deal, but just to show you how the family was, and we're talking about 1967, 68, his girlfriend was African American. And his family embraced her like she was just one of their own. And I remember, this is kind of funny, he stood outside the bus, because Muir had a great band, and he stood outside the bus at Glendale, and he says, "You all ain't got no soul, you ain't got no colored people." They had no African Americans, or at that time he would say colored people, on your band, so you don't have any soul. We've got soul because we've got black people, we've got folks here who can have soul. So anyway, the church, the Dillingers were active, strong members at Altadena United Methodist Church. And so Altadena United Methodist Church, in Altadena, small little church, but we also had the first African American who was on the Rose Court, Sylvia Peebles. You had the Dillinger family who was there helping out. So we had a lot. The church was really involved. The pastors were open-minded. They preached togetherness. It was a very good experience. So that small church, of which I had an experience in and grew up with, again, was an integrated church, multicultural, just very strong Christian people who said we are all the same, and we need to look at all the same. We can't have discrimination.
Yeah. Kevin, I can't even imagine how you have such a positive outlook about, I was trying to picture myself in the mid-60s or even early 70s being in a situation like that. But I really appreciate the way that you are looking at it. And this is an experience that it's very difficult for me to relate. Tsega, this is where I would really like, your experience as a family therapist, and you talk about generations, and you talk about the conversation between fathers and the children, and and obviously the Black experience. So I would really like you to interact and what is your perspective on this too?
Well, I was just thinking about, I came to the United States in 1986. And from when I came from Ethiopia, I went from the airport directly to LAX, and I came to Northwest Pasadena, right here on Oakland Avenue or Oakland Street, right here, a few blocks from Lake. And that's when America existed in my mind. Before then it didn't exist. But that's when you had the war on drugs, all that craziness. As an immigrant, the only exposure I have is on TV. So everything you're exposed to TV kind of becomes your picture. So it's kind of skewed thinking about the African American community, because we didn't have any experience before then. At that time there was no internet or anything. So I feel like we ourselves were deprived from really having this partnership relationship with different communities, because everybody kind of staying to itself and trying to survive. And I even remember coming to Lake Avenue Church a few weeks after I got here. It was overwhelming. I think the sanctuary was just built, so I kind of stayed away from it. And so now I'm listening to you. I'm thinking there are some experiences that I feel the same way, but then I really don't. Like I remember, I think it was Pastor Chuck Olson one time when he shook my hand and looked at me straight in my eyes and asked me, "What's your name again?" And Tsega, and you have a nice smile. Good meeting you. And then I remember a few weeks later, he called me by my name. And I said, I knew I existed. It's just interesting how those interactions really make a big difference in the day-to-day life. But so my gift, you as a gift to me in this church is every time I talk to you, you give me such a bigger perspective. You talk about what was in the past. And I remember you took us on a tour a few years back with one of our good friends,
Gibson.
Yeah,
Kurt Gibson.
Kurt Gibson. And I realized, oh my God, so much has happened on this land in the last 500-600 years. It really put me on a student position. I knew I don't know anything, and I got into this whole thing of learning something new. And there are people now, maybe for the first time in their life, they're being exposed to this real race issues that they didn't have to deal with before. And I want you to say a little bit about, where do we start? For me, I had no choice being a Black man. I can't avoid that topic. So I learned because of, and thank God for people like you at Lake that helped me to stay put, be grounded, but also get exposed. So I would like to hear that kind of an advice maybe a little bit later on. But I want you to talk a little bit about this conversation you mentioned the other day, how you compare your conversation as a young man with your dad and now as a father having this conversation with your children. What was that like? And maybe just share a little bit about that experience you've had.
Thank you, Tsega. It was challenging to me, and I didn't really realize it at first. I was sitting down. We were in our kitchen preparing a meal, and my daughter Kelly was talking about what was going on and the bigotry and the racism and all the things that were going on with Black Lives Matter and what people were doing. And I was like, wow. And I found myself saying, okay, Kelly, you have to look at it with a different perspective, maybe. Don't be narrow focused. Have a much wider perspective. And then I saw something that really touched me. I saw pain. And I realized at that moment that I had this exact same conversation with my dad 52 years earlier in 1968. And I remember my dad telling me, Kevin, you got to look at the bigger picture. Yes, things are going on, but, things might get better. And I just thought, I said, with our leaders being killed, with integration being fought, with affirmative action giving us opportunities that we never had, and just a big thing on affirmative action, people look at affirmative action and say it was a negative thing. Affirmative action was only giving us a chance to have equal footing. It wasn't giving us a step up. because in many cases, we didn't have that opportunity. So affirmative action just meant, let's give someone an opportunity, a fair opportunity as much as you can. And with that opportunity, we can succeed. Okay. So I looked at that and I said, man, I thought we had overcome. And I looked at it, I said, 52 years later, we're having the same conversation. It was painful. It got to the point of anger. And I know that as a Christian, you've got to control anger so it doesn't go into rage. And I always try to think as a Christian first, but I was angry. Just be honest, I was angry. I said, this is my daughter. She didn't deserve this. And I had to calm myself down. I'm still a little emotional right now, thinking about it. I said, what is it within the human experience that think about 50 years, that's a long time, 50 years later, that we would be doing in the exact same thing. And had a chance to reflect. I appreciate Tsega. I called him up, we talked, and I talked to a couple of other good friends of mine, Scott White, and we started discussing things. I started discussing things with my some other friends of mine, and I realized, I said, this is just about pain. And I said, I'm not. After I got over my anger, I realized that the people that we are struggling against are in more pain than we are. See, because you can't look at your brother and say you love him and not treat him fairly and not be in pain. And I go back to my training and conversations with my grandparents, with my mother. My grandfather was 91 years old, and I remember him sitting down saying, Kevin, you got to be better. You got to do better. You got to stay a step ahead. But he never had malice. He grew up a black man in Alabama in the 1890s, and he never had any hate in him. My mother grew up in an integrated environment. They said, people are people. And so I said, we have to be better. We have to do better. And we started having a conversation with my daughter. I said, I understand your pain. Now we have to go on from here. And I think that was the one thing that kind of changed me. I want to interject something right here. And one of the things I talked about the pain, but I believe there's a lot of misinformation out there. And people are only, because they're in so much pain, they say, look at me, I'm hurting. And they don't even know why they're hurting. And the reason that they're hurting is because they don't have knowledge. And one of my favorite Bible verses is from Hosea 4:6. My people are destroyed by their lack of knowledge. See, you don't gain knowledge by looking at the television and seeing someone else spout information that may or may not be true. In the 60s, we had to wait a day. Newspaper journalists were writing. You had a chance to sit on something. Now it's immediate. And there's so much misinformation. I hear people say, well, I hear them talking now, and I'm saying, you got that on this news radio station, or you got this from over here, or you must have gotten this. That's not information. You are ill-advised. You don't have the knowledge. You only get knowledge by letting it simmer and soak in. Okay? Again, my people are destroyed by their lack of knowledge. And their lack of knowledge leads them to pain. Pain leads them to wanting to hurt other people. And that's what happens. And so when you bring it all back around, Tsega, and talking about the conversation with my daughter, I said, let me let you experience that pain, but let me bring you back around. Let me tell you about my experience. And I had to, like I said, I had to share my pain with her. So she realized that, okay, Dad, I understand you recognize my pain. See, because if I don't recognize your pain, see, we can't have a conversation. Exactly. Yeah. See, so I'm in pain. I'm only concerned about me. I recognize your pain. Then we can open up the conversation. I think that's what we need to be in this country now, is we've got people on the far ends, and we're trying to push everybody to the far end. You don't recognize my pain. Recognize their pain. Listen, gain knowledge, and then have that conversation. And encourage them to gain knowledge so that they do not provide misinformation, not only to others, but to themselves, because that's the most important thing. If you feel good about you, it's hard to mistreat other people. Yeah. See, that's the Christian philosophy. Yeah. With Jesus. Yeah. Love, I read the verse this morning says, love one another as I have loved you. So, but you first got to love yourself. Yeah. And people are in a lot of pain. So,
And what you said is the essence of the conversation we had in the other episode to understanding before agreeing. Exactly. Agreeing is a completely different thing, but understanding is a must, even if you understand. So, Tsega, so go ahead. Sorry,
sure. If you have a couple of minutes, I just thought of a story, and this individual actually gave me the permission to talk about this experience. Definitely, I won't use his name, but it's in a local church, and the person is probably in his late 70s. He's a Caucasian Christian young man who is a leader in his church, and we were part of the small group. And one day we're sitting and talking, and he told me this experience, and it just reminded me now, how does somebody sit with this kind of pain? Because the story he told me was he was a young 17-year-old, I think, and their church had they're going to a camp. So they went, the youth group. Another church from Pasadena, Northwest Pasadena, was also there. This was a black church. And he said, we had a great time with the other kids. They prayed together. They played ball. They did, amazing weekend or whatever, however long they were. Then they came back. They exchanged phone numbers. And he said, we came back. And after a few weeks, we kept in touch with those guys. And we invited them over to come to our church. And he said, one day they came. He said he doesn't know what happened, but there was this big roar in their church. They actually let go of the youth pastor. And he said he was confused. Nobody was sitting and processing with him. He said the minute he turned 18, he went to the military and tried to put everything, forget about the whole thing. And now here's this man in his 70s. What does he do with this experience that nobody helped him to process at that young age? Nobody recognized the pain. Because for him, he said, there was something disconnected there. There's something didn't make sense because what he's being taught, what he sees in his church, the love, the care for one another was so great. But then suddenly something happened. Clearly, he knows it, he sees it around, but nobody sat down and talked to him. So I think there's a lot of that goes on in everyone. Like for me, I had to sit down and realize, no, Tsega, your experience started in 1986. You were not part of what happened before. It doesn't matter how much I try. So I had to stay in recognize my own, ignorance or whatever, but also learn to be humble, to know that God's story is so much bigger. Mm-hmm. And in that, he works in individual lives. So I think if we create space like this where we hear one another's experience, recognize the pain, the frustration, the disappointment, so that we can move on together. I think that's really key. Because even within one group, even within one family, two kids can have totally different experience. You know, I remember at Fuller, we had a professor who said he wrote a book about his father, Ray Anderson. And in his 80s, somebody gave his brother, who lives in the East Coast, the same book. So his brother read the book and called him up and said, what are you talking about? Which father are you talking about? Because he took his experience from his dad, and the meaning he got out of all the stuff that they went through was so different from the other, from his own brother that they grew up in the same home. So I think in a church setting like this, in this kind of family, we have to expect that. Everybody has different experience, but we need that time to sit down, listen to each other's story, validate our experiences. And because of Christ and the Holy Spirit, we need to move forward. So I just want to say it's very encouraging to hear these stories from...
and I think the way you communicating that to your daughter, and you draw from your painful experiences and communicating that knowledge to your daughter, and based on Hosea, with a biblical lens to it, right? Like you're not giving her a political agenda or, so there's a big difference between being stuck in the past as opposed to learning from the past, right? Instead of imprisoning, being imprisoned in the past, but you pass that on. And I'm just picturing myself, I'm a daughter. I have a daughter, two daughters too. So that communication from generation to generation, from a biblical perspective, thank you. That's probably one of the most very emotionally intelligent way of doing it too. I'm going to bring it to a close right now for this episode, but Kevin is not going to go anywhere and Tsega is not going to go anywhere. We are going to come back to you with more of this. But I just wanted to say this, Kevin. The first story you shared, and particularly as a pastor of Lake Avenue Church, you walk into this church where you were a complete stranger in so many different ways, and this gentleman whom you can't even remember the name became such a channel of a friendship for you. And I could notice, I could look at your eyes and the way your eyes sparkle when you're talking about that gentleman, right? And Tsega also shared a very similar experience about Lake Avenue Church. And so as I close, I also want to share my experience. When I came in, I remember the first Sunday we walked in, we were a little late and we were doing church shopping, so we wanted to come to this church and to see how it looks like. And Joanne, my wife, and I walked in a little late. It was around 5-10 minutes late, and we were trying to find a place where to sit. And then when I could hear this shush, shush voice from behind. I thought, oh man, somebody is shushing us, right? It's so bad to walk in. Then I looked at it, and there is this lady who was actually inviting us. She said, hey, come and sit with us. And she and her husband were sitting, and we sat with them. And then she started asking us about questions. Where are you coming from? Why are you here? And then her husband started shushing her, no, don't talk while the sermon is going on, right? But then eventually he's an engineer from, JPL and all that. Then he realized that I had an engineering background. Anyway, we struck this amazing friendship. And then they said, next week when you come, make sure you sit next to us, okay? And we had no plan to come back next week. So next week we were planning to go to another church. So next week I said, man, we have to go back. Otherwise that lady will come looking for us, because she was that serious. Now that turned out to be Bill and Diane Spuck, whom, pretty much everybody in this church know. But that one experience, it's not the sermon, it's not, they were all great. But that first contact and that welcoming attitude of this church, and that positive stories that we heard from all the three in this table, so I just want people to leave them with that assurance of hope. That is still the work of the Holy Spirit, dispensing through ordinary people, being an usher or a pastor or just a church member who's sitting in the pew. So I'm so proud of being a Lake Avenue member and a pastor, and may the Holy Spirit bring us more wisdom and knowledge and healing that we require. So we will come back with another episode of The Kitchen Table. Thank you and God bless you.